Welcome to episode 79 of the Band Hive Podcast.
You're listening to the Band Hive Podcast, the #1 online resource for DIY bands to learn about the music business and touring. If you want to turn your band into a lean, mean touring machine, you're in the right place. Now, let's get this show on the road.
It is time for another episode of the Band Hive Podcast. My name is James Cross, and I'm here with Matt Hose of Alive in Barcelona. Matt, it is great to have you back on the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty awesome, James. How is everything for you over on the east side?
That's great to hear, and I'm doing well. This week, we got a riding lawnmower for our giant lawn for the first time in like 16 years of living here, where we did a push mower for like 2 acres. So I'm very excited to have a riding mower finally, and I'm totally that old guy who has like the giant hat and sunglasses and is like hunched over on the mower trying not to tip over on the hills and all that. So it's been fun, but it's also been a true adventure.
That's good, man. What you have to do is go get a little high-powered engine and put it in there, and then you can start racing it. Crank that thing all the way up and just rip around your yard. Then you'll take a corner and it'll just fling you straight off. But if you make a video, great content.
True. I'll finally be able to start a TikTok page.
Yeah, you just got to get a GoPro and mount it to your steering wheel. And so it'll just be a close-up of your face, and then you're just getting flung off in different directions.
Well, actually, real quick, I'm going to sidetrack before we get down to business here. And years ago, 2 friends and I went riding around on an ATV, and an ATV really is only meant to have 2 people on it at most. So as my friend was driving, I was on the back left, and the other friend was on the back right. And we took this turn, and I hear, "Wah!" And I see a puff because my friend flew off the side and landed in, I don't know what they're called, but it's those plants with like the white fluffy stuff on top. They're kind of like 2 to 3 feet tall.
Natural corn dogs?
Yeah, basically that. Yeah, exactly. And there's just this puff of like all that stuff flying up. And my friend who was driving grabbed onto me thinking I was the one that was falling. I'm like, "Why are you grabbing me? The other guy's already in the bushes back there." So yeah, that was fun. That had to be like a decade ago, but that was really fun. I wish we had a GoPro because that definitely would have gone viral.
Say stuff like that's always fantastic. You think back and you're like, man, one of us could have died doing that, but boy, was it exhilarating.
Yeah, exactly. Well, anyway, before we get sidetracked too long here, I want to introduce our special guest this week. Greg Lloyd is joining us. And for the second episode in a row, we have a guest from Phoenix, Arizona. Welcome to the show, Greg. Thanks for joining us. And how are you doing today?
Hey, guys. I am doing fantastic. It is sunny and about 95 degrees here in Phoenix.
That sounds about on par for Phoenix.
In the summer, oh yeah.
Yeah, man, I can't wait till it's like 80 here. I think 95 would be a little much for Vermont.
Yeah, fun tidbit, actually. Phoenix is the only city in this country where I've ever walked out of a house before 6 a.m. and it was over 95 degrees.
In the summer, it's just like anywhere else. Like in Vermont, it's cold for 6 months out of the year. In Phoenix, it's hot, but it's definitely weird. I still haven't gotten used to walking out of the house at like 10 p.m. and having it be triple digits in the middle of the summer. That's still weird.
Hotter than you're in the interior of your house. It's all right. Everybody there just has really nice AC, and pools are like all over the place.
I never appreciated like the backyard pool until I moved here, and I was like, now it's essential.
Absolutely. My buddy Thomas lives down there. I think we're at Scottsdale area, and every time that we go there, it's like, oh, let's go to Thomas's house, and we get there, and it's like, let's just sit in his pool. That's all we want to do. I want to get out of the pool and get hot again so I can jump back in the pool and feel refreshed.
Yep. It's like the opposite of a sauna. Dry heat and then jump in the pool versus dry cold and jump in the steam room.
Yeah.
I feel like most people that like live here long term, like I don't mind the heat as much as I mind the cold. So like I never miss scraping my car off or like walking through slush. Like I never miss those things. But the trade off is it's a little bit hot. You kind of don't really leave the house for 2 or 3 months in the middle of the summer, and you crank the AC.
Yeah, and I don't leave the house for like 6 months in the middle of winter. San Diego was nice. I lived in San Diego for a while, and that was like perfect. It was like 45 at the coldest and 85 at the warmest, unless like there was a couple days in summer where it hit 95 or 100, and it was amazing. It's a good medium between the two. Anyway, as much as I'd love to talk about geography and weather all day, I'm terrible at bantering about weather for far too long and making everyone tune out before we even start the show.
That was my bad. I could have picked any other topic.
No.
Oh no, trust me. Every single episode, we start talking about the weather. We're like, it's snowing in Colorado. It's snowing in Vermont. Who knew? That's been like the last 20 episodes.
A couple weeks from now, on like July 4th, I'm sure we'll be like, oh yeah, it's snowing in Colorado.
Yeah.
I saw on my time hop today, it snowed a year ago today.
1 year ago today, huh?
Amazing.
Yep. Anyway, I said I was going to stop talking about weather, and here I am still talking about weather. So, to introduce you, Greg, you are a mastering engineer, and you also have a website for DIY artists, somewhat similar to Bandhive, but with your own unique twist on it. And a lot of people might be thinking, wait, if it's similar to Bandhive, why are you on the show? But the thing is, and I want to make this point to artists, there are enough people in the audience to go around. Like, I'm not threatened by other people who make content for artists because everyone has different styles, everyone has different preferences. Like, I've watched mixing tutorials and been like, well, the content's the exact same, but I like that guy and I don't like that guy, so I'm going to watch guy A. So if somebody, for example, hates my voice, please go listen to Greg instead. And I'm not just saying that, but Greg also has really good content, and I myself read Greg's content. So I would encourage everyone to listen up, check this out, learn from a mastering engineer who works with DIY artists. And that's my intro for you is artists shouldn't feel the competition. I'm not feeling the competition here. So artists should also know like, hey, we're stronger together than we are if we're working against each other.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's like a big part of the whole DIY scene, right? It's like supporting each other and building ideally like real community. And you can't do that if you're just looking over your shoulder for competition all the time. It's okay to have the same things happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Last night, I made a little video on Instagram about mastermind groups because I was about to step into my mastermind. And one of my friends commented and said, yeah, this would never happen around here. All the bands in this area are just looking out for themselves. They would never share what made them successful. And I'm like, dude, that's not going to work. Those are going to be the bands that don't really go as far as they could if they were all working together. And I think a great example of that is Rusty Pistachio of the band H2O. He's an amazing jeweler, and he has made limited run jewelry for pretty much every band in like the alt rock scene. So AFI, My Chem, Weezer. I think he did Fall Out Boy or Panic at the Disco. Like anyone who's everyone in essentially the Warped Tour scene. And they're not looking at like, oh, we're not going to support you because you're in a different band. They're just like, you make good stuff. We want to sell it to our fans. So can you do like 200 limited pieces for us?
Amazing. Yeah. I love that.
Yeah, I love it. And they're working together. And if you think about it, all the bands on Warped Tour, for the most part at least, would work together. Like band A, their bus breaks down. Guess what? Band B comes and picks them up and says, okay, we're going to get you to the next show. That's just how it goes. You have to stick together. And if you don't, that's just not good. You're not going to make it. And if you have that, I hate to make this political, but I'm going to. It's like Brexit. If you say, and let me just say, I'm not British, so I don't know all the intricacies, but if you say, we're going to do our own thing separate from the rest of you, it's going to cause problems. Like right now, I know anybody ordering stuff in the UK from Europe has to pay insanely high import taxes. So if you as a band say, we're not going to share anything with any other band, you're just locking yourself out. You are the Brexit of the music world.
Yeah, I mean, and it's okay to be like limited in your partnerships, but you're still coming at it from the attitude of wanting to partner, and that's the thing with DIY is like, obviously you want to do it yourself. Doing it yourself doesn't have to mean that you do everything yourself in complete isolation. Like people can support each other, and it's not even really important that we all like the same music. Like I'm sure all of us have slightly different musical taste on this call right now, but it doesn't mean we can't support each other and be helpful. And that's actually super helpful. I mean, being an artist is hard. If artists aren't going to support each other, like nobody else is going to.
The perfect summation of that. For anybody listening, here's a book for you to buy. It's called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I'm sure James will plug that in a minute. I highly recommend reading this. It's by Stephen J. Covey. He has a lot of really awesome things in there but the main thing that you guys are talking about right now is a win-win situation. Too many times people in every industry really feel as though situations have to be win-lose, or one person has to maintain the status quo, and that's going to be only beneficial for the other party. I would highly recommend reading this book because he actually spends a great deal of time talking about a paradigm shift and basically saying, like, if you feel like this isn't, if you feel like one of the two parties is losing, then take a little bit more time, refine what you're doing, and create a better plan. And so it does become a win-win. And sometimes, like, in terms of business, a lot of that stuff can really get muddied between contracts and language barriers, distance barriers, talking over email, talking over phone, things like that. And so he actually talks a lot about how to create win-win situations, and basically where it's just this, it creates a community and network of people who, you know that you want to work with them because these are people that are willing to, like, not bend their rules, but they're willing to find the path of least obstruction in order to make things work. And then on top of that, when you walk away from those situations, like when you find people that are willing to work on a deal until it works, like those are people you want to keep around long term. And so the power of the win-win situation is super, super awesome. I highly recommend everybody read The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen J. Covey. It's another life-changing text.
Yeah, so that'll be in the show notes at bandhive.rocks/79. That's bandhive.rocks/7 and 9.
Thanks for the plug.
Greg, it looked like you had something to add to that.
A lot of the ways I like to frame those same concepts is that, like, your artistic life is not a zero-sum game. It's not a pie where, like, you get some and then somebody else gets less because you got more. It's, if you work together, everybody gets a limited pie.
Absolutely. No, that was the Viking mentality, is that there's only one pie. And so I have to take pie from other people in order to get mine. Then they traveled around, and then all the Scottish and the Irish were like, hey, we actually learned that if we just stay in one spot and collectively work together, then we can create community and things that are better for everybody. And we can discover other resources that we've never used. And that's really what it's all about, is, building a network of people who discover resources, who work collectively. Ray Kroc is a name that's associated with McDonald's, and he is neither one of the McDonald's brothers. Now, Ray Kroc owns McDonald's, and how did he do it? Well, he did it by partnering with McDonald's at first. He started by coming in and seeing how they did things, and he said, you guys have a perfect business model, so I'm not going to try and reinvent the world of the quick service burger. Instead, he brought milkshakes into McDonald's. By slowly building this partnership with the McDonald brothers, he ended up getting a larger stake in their company than even they had, because he just chose to build something collectively with them rather than try to compete with them. And if you don't know the name Ray Kroc, then Google it. It's everywhere.
Yeah, or watch The Founder.
Yep, that's another one.
Which will also be in the show notes at bandhive.rocks/79. So before we jump into things and get to know you, Greg, I just wanted to point out that one other thing that is in line with everything that you and Matt have said so far is always add more value than the amount of value you take. That is how you build a strong two-way relationship. And that's what artists can do. Add value to people. Add value to other artists' lives. And guess what? They're going to remember that. And when they have an opportunity that they can't do, they might just think of you and say, hey, you know what? We're booked that night, but my friend's band XYZ, they'd be great. Why don't you go hit them up? Here's their email. Boom. That's adding value. And that is how a community gets built, because everybody knows that band who are just total jerks. Don't ever work with them. Like, their music might be great, but they're terrible people. We're not going to work with them. So that all aside, I love this start to the conversation. But before we go further, Greg, can you tell us a little bit about your background in music? Like, what inspired you to make music your life?
So for me, it's actually been like a series of pretty fortuitous moments. Like, I had kind of like the initial moment when I was a kid. Yeah, I think I was in first or second grade, and we had a choir come to our school, and I'd never heard like a live choral group before. They happened to be really good, and it was in a gym. So like, it was a super like immersive experience, and at that point I was like, this is great. Like, I kind of want to do something like this. I actually sang in a boys choir for like 5 or 6 years. I had a mean Shenandoah. It was fantastic. And then eventually from there, I started getting more into the instrumental side. I'm actually a trumpet player, and I took that pretty far. I ended up going to music school and getting 2 degrees in classical trumpet. I was really still am into the classical scene and playing in orchestras and kind of that whole thing. And so I did that. I went through and got 2 degrees and learned how to play, and have had a pretty decent career playing classically. Played with a lot of orchestras, played with a lot of local groups, small groups, big groups. From there, I started doing session work. Just as a classical player, I'd get calls to come and play in recording sessions, and kind of fell into the production and studio side and was like, oh, I like this. This is cool. And then after another long series of different journeys, ended up focusing on the mastering specialty after that, which is actually really quite similar in skill set to classical music. Like it's very highly detailed. It's very subtle kind of little things. It's technical in nature. It's very focused on small details, which is a big part of what you do if you're a classical musician. So it's very similar.
Nice. It sounds like a really cool natural progression, not to make a music pun.
And I wouldn't have really ever expected to go in that direction, but I got extremely lucky in my classical music education, is that I had a bunch of great teachers who were also great freelancers. And they were basically the whole time were like, hey, you have to be open to going in different directions. And if I had kind of stayed super focused on the orchestral track, I don't know that I would actually be as happy. I had a big kind of crisis when I got out of music school, and I was taking these crazy orchestral auditions, which if you don't know about those, they're really intense. Like you're playing up against 200 people behind a screen, on the day, and you have to beat out a lot of people in front of a committee of other musicians who have been playing for 40 years. So it's really intense. And I don't know if I had kept going down that track if I would have been happy. I would have just played the same music over and over and over again for 10 or 15 years to try and get a job, to keep on playing that same music over and over and over again. So for me, it wasn't really going to be the best fit. And so I had to go through another series of moments and progressions of figuring out, well, if I don't want to do this, what do I want to do?
Yeah. I think that's something that a lot of artists should pay attention to and learn. For me, it was a similar thing that where I am now, I did not see myself here 5 years ago. I thought I was going to be on the road for the rest of my life, tour managing and all that. And then my priorities shifted, and I was like, you know what? I don't want to do this anymore. And that was my dream for half a decade. And then it just changed. So I think artists need to be open to changing what they want to do. But also, if opportunities come up and it's a good opportunity, just say yes. Don't hold yourself back by saying, oh, well, I don't know, this isn't really what I do. Just say yes, give it a shot. If you try it and you hate it, don't do it again, but give it a shot.
Absolutely. No, that's super powerful, James. I think a lot of people are archaic in their way of thinking that it's you get into this mindset where you have a certain thing that you have to do. I have to chase my dreams. I call it the Hollywoodization of who we are as individuals. I find that as I get older, the more it's the more you actually learn the way life works. It's like you're saying, Greg, if you as a musician, if you're not able to try different things, if you're not able to maybe I want to dabble in orchestral music, maybe I want to be a session musician, maybe I want to have a podcast. James, when you contacted me years ago about doing this podcast and said, hey, do you want to do this? I could have been like, oh, no, that sounds like work. I'm supposed to be a touring musician. I'm not supposed to be on a podcast. What do you mean? And honestly, all that would have done is shortchange me. I would have missed out on so many awesome conversations, so many awesome opportunities, meeting new people. And there's too many things to count, too many good memories to go back and even reminisce about. In the end, archaic thought just limits you. I love the movie Yes Man because it just follows Jim Carrey as somebody who says no to everything all the time. And then when he starts saying yes to things, suddenly all these opportunities arise. And it's well, yeah, that's wonderful because that's exactly how it is. Say yes, try something. If you don't like it, be honest with yourself and be honest with the people around you and try something new. Follow what you love, but you only find out what you love by trying.
Well, Matt, first of all, thank you so much. I'm glad you feel that way, and it's been a pleasure to have you here. I think that was almost 2 years ago.
It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a blast having you on the show. At first, every other episode, and now pretty much every episode lately. So thank you for all the work you're putting in. It's definitely appreciated.
You carry the team.
Well, like I said a week or two ago, I was like, I could not do this podcast by myself unless I had a guest every single episode because I hate talking to myself. That's why I stopped doing videos and started doing a podcast because I was like, hey, I can have a co-host and I can have guests. But yeah, as we go further into this, a few weeks ago on episode 75, which if you haven't heard it, I'm going to plug it, bandhive.rocks/75. That's bandhive.rocks/75. We spoke with Vadim from DIY Recording Guys about artists and how they can record home demos. And for a lot of artists, that's the path they choose. You know, they record a demo at home and then go to the studio. But there are other artists who don't do that, and they do their whole production at home. And for some of them, that works out really well. And for many of them, not so great. It's something that I personally don't recommend unless one of the members is actually an engineer. Like, I have several friends who are engineers and are in a band, and they do really well with it. But I also see a lot of artists who think they're engineers and they're not. And then it just ends up not so great. So Greg, as a mastering engineer, when you get tracks sent to you for mastering, what are some of the common issues that you can identify with artists who probably shouldn't be engineering themselves?
Yeah, so it actually ends up falling into a lot of pretty common issues that I think are mostly technical. Probably the biggest one is uneven bass response in the recording, whether it's a mix issue or a tracking issue caused by usually poor monitoring in the recording area. So like, the typical thing would be if you're trying to mix like on a single set of earbuds or even a single set of headphones, even if you know those headphones well, it's like using rose-colored glasses to try and paint. Like, it's going to color everything that you do, and there's going to be things that like you're not hearing that are getting missed. And that's probably a big one is, just because you plug a set of headphones into an interface does not mean that what you're hearing is actually what's taking place. Room acoustics and having nicer speakers and having like a variety of monitoring systems and being intentional in what you're using that variety for, having a low frequency reference, having a high frequency reference, having a good general purpose reference, and going between all of those is a really simple and great way to get a better picture of what you're doing. And the bass area is really hard because it's just difficult to hear accurately on equipment that's not expensive. You can mitigate that somewhat by, again, variety in the monitoring system. But yeah, pay attention to your bass. You don't need to boost the bass to get a good bass sound. A lot of times it's the opposite. You're actually cutting the bass to bring out focus in that area. Maybe that kind of ties into another technical thing. Like, hopefully, I don't know if this is too technical, but I'm a big fan of using cutting EQ often and boosting EQ sparingly. And I usually see the opposite in home mixers is they'll be boosting stuff all over the place, but they're not really cleaning the tracks up with proper EQing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to lie, when I do mixing, I will boost stuff, but it's always like specific. It's like, oh, I want that like 11K click in the kick, like really narrow Q and boost it 10 decibels. And it's like, that's a specific sound intentionally. And I think what you're talking about, because I see a lot of people do this too, is like, oh, I want more bass. And you see like a very wide bandwidth boost at like 200 or 300 hertz. It's like all that mud.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Totally. Or they just leave stuff in that doesn't need to be there. Like most tracks on your mix that are not the bass guitar or the kick drum do not need really most things in 20 to 40 hertz. I like to think of it kind of like if you go to a movie and you see like, something like a Marvel movie, right? Like it's not shaking the entire time. Like your chest is not moving the entire time during the Marvel movie. They save those like sub moves for the really big moments where like the Hulk is like pulling down a building or something. And so be very sparing with your use of the sub region, 20 to 40 hertz. Most of what you need is above 40 hertz. And that's actually good news because you don't necessarily need a sub to mix, but it can be helpful in certain situations too.
A few years ago, when hardcore music specifically was really exploding, there was something that a lot of my audio engineering friends, a term that I heard them coin, which was the war on loud. And it's the curse of the musician always saying, well, can we make this louder? Why is this not louder? And one of my buddies, I remember him just saying, well, just turn the volume up. And it was this concept that people couldn't get, that they always, the artist always wanted this bass that was rattling their chest. And they always wanted these noise, that, just literally noise. So it was actually really interesting. You can go back and watch a bunch of studio sessions with people like Joey Sturgis that had learned how to be like, oh yeah, instead of playing your guitar, you're just going to ring out one single chord at a time. He tweaked and did all of these weird different things so that he could try to cut out a lot of his unneeded frequencies and he could still have this loud volume. And it was like such a huge issue in the audio engineering community because people would be like, no, we need this louder. And it's like, no, I literally just paid like $40,000 so that the sonics are perfect, not so that everything is loud. You know, the louder you get, the muddier it gets. So I always feel bad for audio engineers that have to work with artists who say like, we need this louder.
Well, and like I always frame it where like, I worked in restaurants for a long time, so I tend to use a lot of cooking analogies. So be prepared for that. Compression is like salt. Like you need salt in your cooking. If you don't use salt, everything's bland. But if you use too much salt, it gets real gross real fast. So it's really just about finding the right amount for the right situation. And the thing that makes it tricky is that that's a moving target. Like the compression that you use for hardcore is going to be way different than what you use for like an indie track or an orchestral track or whatever. And so following only your intuition it's really easy to get led astray. That's where like as a mastering engineer, we use stuff like volume matching and you can do that actually very easily now. You kind of have to know what that is, but volume matching is basically like don't make a compression choice until you've heard it at an equal volume A and B. Because anything that sounds louder is automatically going to make you think, ooh, that's better. And then you're just going to keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it. And then before you know it, you've used too much salt and everything's just kind of gross.
I love it. Perfect analogy.
And there's no MSG in the recording world. So you have to figure it out. You have to actually know how much salt to add.
MSG is the best. I really wish if somebody can figure out like the MSG of like a DAW where you just click one button and it makes everything sound awesome, no more jobs for us.
That would be wonderful.
AI mastering. Give it 10 years and it might actually be worth it.
Yeah, I mean, I've gone up. I always will go up against different AI mastering services, and if artists have questions about it, I'll be like, yeah, I'll just do a test for you. And you can compare yourself, and the human always wins. But I have to say, surprisingly good. I don't know that it's going to ever replace human mastering because there's always a human component. There's always a creative component that's pretty huge, actually. And again, presets don't work, and that's all that is a giant automated preset. But it can be a legitimate introduction to what mastering can do to your music. And for a lot of DIY artists, if you have zero budget and you don't have the time or any kind of money to hire a human to master, or if you're practicing mixing and you want to see how your mixes react to the mastering process, doing that with an algorithmic service is way faster and easier than going back and forth with a human. So I usually will actually recommend algorithmic mastering service as an educational tool if you're trying to learn how to mix and you want to see how it reacts to the mastering process.
Yeah, I think that's a great use for it. And I've started using it as a pre-master test to see what will this sound like when it's mastered. And for me, I mean, it sounds better than my masters a lot of the time because I'm not a mastering engineer. I'm a mixing engineer who, if the band doesn't have a mastering budget, I'll say, yeah, I'll master it. And at this point, now I'm thinking maybe I will just send them the AI master because if it's better than what I can do, who cares?
Yeah, and also it's great to clarify the artist's intention as to what they want their mastering style to sound like. As well as I do, if you send a mix to 3 or 4 different mastering engineers, you're going to get 3 or 4 different colors. And so instead of having that be something where the artist is having to decide that by testing a bunch of masters, if you just get a basic idea of the style that you like and what you're going for, then that can make the human that you choose to hire a more focused and quick decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And I could see that also being hey, we really like this AI master. Can you do something in this direction, but tweak it to fit this song?
I would love that. For me, one of the bigger things with if there's any kind of back and forth in the mastering process, it's usually a lot of times more of a communication problem where either the artist isn't communicating what they want exactly, or they don't maybe know what they want exactly because they haven't done it before, or I don't know, they've used a different process. So just the intentionality, clarifying the intention of what you're looking for in the mastering is a great way of using Lander, and it's a great way of seeing what you can and can't do during the process.
That's awesome. That was one of the things that actually Vadim mentioned on episode 75 was that he loves getting an outside song. It's like of a different artist. Like, what do you want your song to sound like? He wants your stems. He wants your ideal mixed version of it. Mix it yourself and send it to him. And then he wants a reference song of another artist, external. And I thought that combination was a really nice triad because it gave you all the pieces that you needed. It gives me the content to work, gives me how they think that they want it to sound, and then a standard for which to kind of compare and contrast with, which I love hearing that same concept reinforced only 4 episodes later. I love it.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Like if an artist was sending me stuff and it was a choice from my end of being like, don't give me communication as to what you're looking for and like trust that I'm just going to guess right, or send me like a algorithmic master that's like close and you're like, okay, I know I want this. I'm going to take the algorithmic master as a reference every single time because that just gives me the ability to do a better job and to get closer to what you actually want.
Fantastic.
Definitely. Well, going further into the detail of home recording, the bedroom produced album can be really effective for some artists. Like I mentioned earlier, for some artists, it's great, but ultimately it comes down to the skill level of whoever is doing the recording or the production at home. When do you think a home recording is appropriate for an artist?
That's probably like another big, maybe the biggest issue I see working with a lot of DIY artists is generally misunderstanding both the purpose and the execution of a successful bedroom recording. A lot of bedroom recordings, there's a lot of myths and kind of wishful thinking behind them because the story is super compelling, right? Like if I say, hey, you can buy a bunch of cheap gear, record a bunch of songs very quickly in your bedroom, and then blow up and be touring worldwide in like a month or two, like everybody wants that to be a thing, but that's not really always the reality of how those records were made. So I've actually got a few different case studies that we can go through of different bedroom style recordings, and we can kind of look for some patterns between them because there are some very clear patterns between bedroom records that have been successful and the bedroom records that have just died on Bandcamp and never gotten listened to. The first one, and this is going back into the 80s, Bruce Springsteen did an album called Nebraska, which the story of that album is Bruce had done a lot of studio recordings up to that point, wanted to kind of do something different. So he took an early cassette multi-track recorder. I think it was like a 4-track Tascam, recorded a bunch of demo style tracks in a New Jersey bedroom. And then after they took those cassette tracks, took them into the studio, had a producer come in, had a couple engineers come in, touch them up and professionally mixed and mastered them. And I would not say I'm like a massive Springsteen fan, but if I'm going to listen to Springsteen, it's going to be Nebraska. Like, it's a really great album. It's super genuine, and that's what you're getting from the bedroom is like you're getting the genuine connection and the intimacy with the artist. And in this particular case, it really worked for Bruce because a lot of his earlier records had been very clean and very highly studio produced, and particularly in the 80s, like lo-fi, hi-fi wasn't really a thing. So if you were recording in a studio, it was gonna be very clean. It was gonna be very polished. And there's a lot of intimacy in what Bruce Springsteen does, but nobody really had ever heard that before he did the bedroom record. And so it was this big kind of different sound that worked out really well. And I still think it really holds up. I think it's the best Bruce Springsteen record. I really love it. That's case study number 1.
This history lesson is fantastic.
I think it's amazing that even back then, the process was do it at home and then take it to the studio to have it polished up, which I think is probably where you're going with this next case study too.
Yeah, it's going to be like that for all of them. No, spoiler alert. But like what is important to notice is that the balance of professional treatment versus home treatment is going to be slightly different for all these case studies. And it should be different for your music and by individual project. Like not every project has to be the same, and every project can have a different mix of professional treatment and home treatment, but it's always a balancing act, and that's always contextual to the individual project and the individual artist. So we'll come forward in time a little bit, and A lot of these are going to be a little bit more on the indie side. The very famous mythological album from Bon Iver, For Emma Forever Ago, the classic like early 2000s, what now is like a blueprint for neo-folk, hadn't really been done before. So the story of this album, for those that don't know, is Justin Vernon, the lead singer and musician in Bon Iver, had gone through a bunch of really intense personal things and needed to get away. So he went up to his dad's or his parents' hunting cabin in northern Wisconsin, kind of like an off-grid property, brought like a small recording setup. I think it was a laptop and like a small interface, recorded a whole bunch of songs in the cabin, and then the record blew up, right? Like that's the story that you hear. What you don't hear is like the stuff that happened after the cabin took place, which is he brought those tracks that were on his laptop back down to North Carolina, took them into a professional studio, did some more touch-up work. I think he did a couple overdubs in the studio this time, as well as some like editing and cleaning. The mixing was hired out on For Emma Forever Ago, and the mastering was hired out on For Emma Forever Ago. So again, it's a combination of two processes. We've got the raw, intimate cabin recordings, but we still have, quite a bit of professional production in this case. And the thing I like to mention about Bon Iver, because it's a pretty popular indie band, and a lot of people kind of hold Justin Vernon up as like a great example of like the indie style, is Justin Vernon is kind of like a unicorn. Like I would say he's probably one of the few musicians out there that actually does legitimately have the skill set to write music, record music, mix music, master music, produce music, do all of the things and do them at a professional level. That's extremely rare. But what you'll notice if you start reading his liner notes is he never chooses to wear all of the hats on a given project. There's always something that he's not doing. Even if it's just like professional mastering at the end or some different combination, he's never choosing to do every single hat on the project himself. There's always something that he's hiring out. And the reason he does that is because he's very smart and he knows just because I can do something doesn't mean I should necessarily do it in this case. So yeah, that's case study number 2, the cabin record For Emma Forever Ago.
That reminds me, I'm going to jump in here real quick. Probably 15 years ago now, Wilco wanted to record in a barn. And so they hired, can't remember now if it was Mark Rebell or John Pines, but they hired one of them to just take a bunch of ADATs, which for people who don't know, an ADAT is an old digital recording technology, which was basically like a digital tape, and record them in this barn live. And that became one of their records. I don't remember which one, but it was so interesting. And I apologize to Mark Rebell and John Pines. I can't remember which one of them did this, but I got to see them talk about it. And the reason I can't remember which one did it is they both were like co-hosting the talk. And one of them was like, oh yeah, here's how we did this album. So anyway, it was a really interesting thing to hear, like, hey, this was an at-home recording technically. Like, it was in their barn on a farm somewhere that one of the guys owned or was renting or whatever. But they still hired a professional to bring the gear and the skills to record.
And that's a pretty common thread in a lot of successful bedroom albums, is it's a combination of two different processes. Like the writing process in the bedroom is super valuable. You have unlimited time to write. You have unlimited time to experiment. That doesn't necessarily mean it's always the best choice to take that into the production space as well. Sometimes it can be, but sometimes not. So again, just being open to different things. And let's just kind of keep going down these case studies real quick. Another really famous indie album from the last few years, Sufjan Stevens, Carrie and Lowell. Another great story on this album. A lot of the main tracks for this album were recorded on tour. So when Sufjan was on tour, he would get done with the show, go back to the hotel room, do some like recording on his laptop, write some songs. And then he ended up taking those recordings into a pro studio, getting them touched up, I believe doing a couple overdubs. The mixing again was hired out and the mastering again was hired out there. So same basic concept. We're combining a bedroom style writing process with a professional production process on some level. That's a great album too, by the way. Another really intimate album. And let's just keep rolling because the theme is kind of the same on all of these. Let's actually talk about the Billie Eilish album, right? So that's probably the biggest, most topical one right now.
Phineas. It's impressive what they did. Is I literally have a quote from him pulled up on my phone right now that I was going to mention after you finished up all your case studies.
Yeah, it's amazing, and it is super impressive what they did. And it's a great album, and it was done really well, and it should be having all the accolades it's having. It's really just the mythology versus the reality. If you actually look into how that album was made, it was quote unquote produced in a bedroom, but what does that actually mean? In this case, what it actually means is that it was written and recorded in a bedroom. And it's interesting to note that they used minimal gear, but it was still professional quality gear. I don't know how crazy we're getting on the technical stuff here, but they used a very common home recording setup, which is a Yamaha HS8 rig. Very good, like kind of low, mid-level monitors with a subwoofer. So that's not like your built-in computer speakers. That's not like one set of headphones. That's a calibrated system. That's like a decent setup. So they recorded using that setup, got the basic tracks done, but the people that took it from there are pretty much the opposite of DIY bedroom people. Like the mixer on the Billie Eilish album was Rob Kinelski. He's like a 30-year industry vet who's done huge albums like Tony Braxton. I picked like the oldest example, but there's a bunch of like very modern, very mainstream pop songs that he has mixed. He is known as a like mainstream pop mixer. You send your stuff to Rob Kinelski if you want it to sound like extremely radio ready, which is again the opposite of the aesthetic of a lot of bedroom artists, right? But yet that worked in this case because it's a combination of those two things. The mastering guy, same thing. The mastering guy on that record was John Greenham, who's again like an amazing mastering engineer, an industry vet. He's done stuff by like the Marias, which is a pretty well-known indie band. But again, it's all mainstream stuff. These are all major label mixers and production people. So it was not Phineas and Billie sitting in their bedroom alone together for 2 months doing the entire album start to finish. It was a combination of different processes that worked, and that's why the album works. It's lo-fi, hi-fi. It's not lo-fi, lo-fi. You know what I mean?
It had that polish and that last 10% that I hear so often missing in home productions. Like I'll hear a home mix and I'm like, it's not a bad mix, but it's not great. Like it doesn't belong on the radio, you know? It's like the top end just sounds dark. There's no clarity. There's no crisp breath, nothing like that. And I will say, you know, feel free to get technical. The HS series by Yamaha, I love them. I have the HS7s, which are technically 6.5-inch speakers, but I love them. Like they work really well. I've had them for half a decade now, and if you get them for a good deal, it's absolutely worth it. I might not pay full price for them, but get a good deal. And HS series, I'd stay away from the HS5, but the 7s and the 8s are great.
Yeah, it's amazing what you can do with not a lot of money and knowing how the process works. But knowing how the process works is what lets you extend the reasonable amounts of money you're paying on the gear. So the knowledge is just really as important as the gear.
Yeah. So on that note, talking about the knowledge, what would you say to the artist who thinks because they have $5,000 in gear, they have the same gear that Billie and Phineas had? Obviously, we've talked about why that was successful, but why shouldn't an artist say, well, I have the gear, let me go ahead and mix this?
Because it's possible that somebody else other than you could do a better job. It's not necessarily going to happen every time. Like there are definitely times where it's very appropriate for an artist to mix themselves, but it's dependent on the project. Like we don't need to have any kind of dogmatic thinking. You don't need to always hire a mixing engineer. You don't always need to hire a mastering engineer. You don't always really need to do anything. But what you do need to be thinking as often as possible is what does the project need? So like I can think of a lot of bedroom records that are maybe recorded by artists who do have engineering experience that they actually wouldn't need to send it out for professional mixing because they can kind of get close enough. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't hire nothing out ever. It just means you need to be considerate about what's valuable to hire out and what you don't need to hire out. And that's going to be project dependent. There are certain records that they really should be complete studio productions where you're going into a recording studio, you're doing the whole thing. There are other records that don't, but that's contextual to the artist. So, going back to the Bruce Springsteen example, the reason that bedroom album worked was as much from the context of the other things that he had released up to that point, as much as it was the fact that it was a bedroom record. If Bruce Springsteen had only ever released lo-fi, bad-sounding bedroom records in his career, I don't know that we would be talking about Bruce Springsteen as being Bruce Springsteen, but it's the combination of those things that really makes it work. So it's really just asking the question, what does this project need? And is there something I can do to improve the quality past the point of my own abilities?
Man, that's so good. And continuing down that path, because I think it's a very important lesson for artists to learn. And even though pretty much everyone in every online forum ever says, don't master your own work if you recorded and mixed it. I think people who do mixing and mastering, that's one thing. But if you did the recording as well, that really should be a third party. Or if you're not confident in your mastering, that should be a third party, even if you just did the mix. For self-recording artists who aren't having that professional recording and mix done, what advantages does hiring a mastering engineer, a human mastering engineer, not an AI mastering engineer, what does that bring to the table?
A lot of times it's a level of professional polish that you couldn't get otherwise. And a lot of times that can take like a lo-fi recording and make it sound lo-fi, hi-fi on its own. So like a mastering engineer could be the hi-fi component of lo-fi, hi-fi if nothing else has been done. And I'll give you an example. Right now I'm working on a project which started off as a set of like home recordings done with like a Tascam digital multi-tracker. And there's all of like the kind of dirt and grunge that's a part of that, right? Like the mics are muddy and like there's noise and like I can hear amp buzz and stuff and all these things that like, if you're in a studio, they're going to try and clean some of that up. In this particular case, for this particular artist, it makes perfect sense to have like minimal mixing done and just put some polish over the top. I like to kind of think of it like icing on the cake mastering, or like, and back to the food analogies. Like if you're looking at 2 slices of cake and one of those slices looks like somebody picked like a fistful of icing and just smashed it on top. And then you have another piece of cake that like has like at least like a modicum of like spreading of the frosting or like maybe like a nice cherry on top. Which one do you think you're gonna be more excited to eat and which one do you think you're gonna go to first? It's not that both can't be delicious cakes. It's that you're gonna definitely go for the one that looks more appetizing, right? And that's a lot of what mastering brings to the table. Is it brings a level of kind of professional polish and standardization to your work, which lets it compete at the same level with other more highly produced things.
Man, that's so great. I want to unpack that a little bit because my fiance, if one of us messes up a meal and it just looks not great, she says, well, it's all going to the same place anyway, so it doesn't matter because it's going to taste the same. And she's right. But at the same time, if I were running a restaurant, which one of those would I never serve to a customer? The one that's all messed up. Because that's just not appealing to people.
Beauty is important.
Exactly. And so if an artist puts out music that looks like a mushy, messed up meal, they are not putting out the best product for their customers, aka their fans. And that's why they need the cake with the icing perfectly spread on top, plus the cherry.
And like a lot of artists, especially DIY artists, can get a little bit intimidated by the use of like kind of businessy terms, like referring to their music as a product. Like a lot of the artists I know like don't like to think of their music that way, no matter how true or not true it may be for them. So when we say product, we're talking about your artwork. Like it's really about doing the best quality artwork. And that's really the common thread through all of this is you have the ability to change the balance of professional versus, home production. That's a balance that can and should change all the time. You're always considering the balance and you're always asking the question, how do I make the best quality artwork? And you have to be willing to say, well, maybe I'm not the best at X, Y, or Z for this particular project. Maybe there's somebody else around who could take my work further than I could take it myself. Maybe not, but it's worth it to ask the question.
It's really important to look at other people's art as well. I think that's one thing that often gets neglected in the music industry is everybody feels like art is a form of their own expression, and they don't realize that there is a certain standard that things just naturally should be held to. You can circumnavigate some of the weirder ones, like Brand New is a band that did a wonderful job of having, for lack of a better term, crappy recordings. They have crappy recordings, but that is their branding, and it fit 100% in with their band name being called Brand New while simultaneously being like the last popular band of that style of music in that decade. Their first album, Déjà Entendu, which literally means already been done. They faceted every single part of their business all into that brand. And so like that worked really, really well for them. For those of you that are trying to compete at a level where like professionalism and like crisp, clean videos, images, audio, all of that is required, go watch an OK Go music video. Go watch any one of them. There's actually one video, I can't think of the name of the song right now, I'm sure James will look it up in a second, where they film the entire music video in less than 3 seconds, and they slowed everything down. Or maybe it's less than 5 seconds. I can't remember.
I remember that one, yeah.
Basically, they shot it, with like a red or whatever, 4,000, frames per second or whatever. And then the video plays in accordance with the music, but you get to see a before and after. And that level of competition in the world of art is like, if you're trying to be crisp, clean, and compete at the top level, there are things that people are doing that are light years ahead of other people. So it's really, really important for you to like dive into other people's art. There's a great mantra: good artists copy, great artists steal. That's an age-old mantra in the music industry. And a lot of classical musicians have heard that plenty of times because there's a whole lot of theories about classical composers that stole work from other classical composers as well, and that some classical composers shouldn't be considered as great because of that fact. Now, I really think everybody should go watch all of OK Go's music videos. They have one where they actually take the Vomit Comet, or a parabolic flight, which is zero gravity, and they did it with like paint and things like that. So you're talking about like the amount of production that went into making a video where everything is supposed to be one single take, and you're doing it in zero gravity. They've got bloopers and tidbits of them like puking on themselves. And these guys have put themselves through like hell. They're doing free falling choreography with paint that doesn't wash off. They've thought about so many levels of their art, and they've perfected each and every one of those. And that was, OK Go branded themselves as always having incredible music videos, and they have delivered 100% of the time. They put out a fantastic product that went viral, and they've never cut corners on their quality ever since. That is very, very, very important for art, period. Doesn't matter what kind of art it is.
You never, ever compromise on the quality of what you're doing. Not ever.
Absolutely. And I'm now noticing that their song titles are quite relevant. The video that was 3 seconds long and slowed down was The One Moment. And the Vomit Comet one is Upside Down and Inside Out. Appropriate.
And they're fantastic. They're good songs, and the videos are literally phenomenal. Like when I saw them for the first time, I felt bad about myself. I felt embarrassed to release certain pieces of art, because you look at music videos nowadays and it's like, okay, it's a band playing and maybe there's like a couple other ominous shots of them in different places. People are like, oh, this music video is so cool. And I'm like, man, where's like an honest mistake?
Oh, that was such a good video.
Where are your Rube Goldberg machines, and where's your Fat Lips by Sum 41? Where are all these videos that have this high production quality? Or like, even Blink-182, to circle all the way back around to the pop punk, I can't remember what video it is, but where they get a check from their record label, and then they just spend the whole video with a shitty camera giving money to people, paying for homeless people to have suits and nice haircuts, and paying old women tons of money to shave their head, and just being ridiculous. But the art was fresh. And it fit with everything who they were. They were, their branding was that they were kids that didn't care about anything. I'm a brand person, so I always like to stay consistent with your brand. But most importantly, keep creating that phenomenal art. Find the art that literally people want to watch 750 times. A video of you playing, like the worst music video in my opinion ever made, was made by Taking Back Sunday, and it's literally a video that they're playing music in the middle of the street. They're literally just playing with 4 cross guards like around them, and the video just circles around them for like 3 minutes. And it's awful. It is literally terrible. I saw half of the video and I will never watch it again. But I'll still go back and watch an honest mistake. I haven't listened to The Bravery in probably, 5+ years. But that video, I'll be like, oh, you want to watch a good video? Boom, here you go. Good art always comes from this like origin spot of like creativity and like relation and like find what works for you. Don't settle. Don't cut your art down. Don't dilute it. Take pride. Put out what's best. Put your best foot forward.
And a lot of like DIY people that I can think of will sometimes be worried about like over sterilization of their recordings through using like a professional. And just for the record, if that's what's happening when you're recording with a professional, you've just chosen the wrong professional to work with. Like any good producer or any good engineer is always going to be contextual to your style. So like in a lot of the indie stuff I do, I actually leave a lot of mistakes in, and I don't like necessarily put everything through RX because having crazy clean recordings is not necessarily the goal of the artist. We just want to maintain the personality of the artists while putting a little bit of professional polish on top. And any good engineer is going to know how to draw those lines. So don't be afraid that if you work with a pro, it's going to over sterilize your recordings. You just got to find the right people to work with. And that's where portfolios come in. And that can also change depending on project, like work with different people. And if you've only ever done a bunch of like lo-fi recordings with more indie style producers, maybe it's actually worth it to hire a super mainstream down the middle production professional like Billie Eilish did. The reason that album works is because it's a combination of both. You get the lo-fi grit from the home recordings, but you get that really tight polish from the production side. Can I do one more case study that I'm just excited to talk about? Is that okay?
Of course.
Yeah, please do.
This is more of like an indie artist who's local to the Arizona scene. Her name is Karima Walker. She does a lot of like cassette tape based music. There's a lot of ambience there, beautiful singing voice, synths, field recordings, that kind of thing. And she has a new album out called Waking the Dreaming Body. And the story of this is kind of in line with the other case studies. And I actually talked to her before doing this podcast. So this is coming, hopefully, at least a little bit directly from the artist. In this particular case, Karima had gone to New York City to try and work with a certain producer. And they had kind of done like some initial meetings, but she got sick. Karima got the flu, and it kind of threw a wrench in all of those plans. So she ended up flying back to Tucson. And then just after that happened, COVID hit, shut everything down. And so she was kind of in a situation where she was forced to complete the album herself with, not a ton of experience being hands-on in the production. She had done a bunch of other albums that had been a mix of like a producer she had worked with and then her own stuff. But she did this one on her own using Ableton and kind of teaching herself. And then at the end, she still hired out professional mastering. So that's an example of like the extreme other side where like, through no really intention to do a bedroom album, it kind of turned into a bedroom album out of necessity. But again, the smart artists know when to hire stuff out and when not to, and how to shift that balance by project. So in this case, Karima had a mastering engineer that she had trust with and that she knew would do a great job on her music. And that was the one component that she hired out while doing everything else herself. I think that's an extreme example, but it's also a very great record, and it totally fits with the theme. It's a mix of professional production and DIY. It's not one or the other.
Yeah, that's great. And I just want to add one more example to when you mentioned a few minutes ago, finding the right producer who won't make it totally sterile. They'll go in and let it have its grit and its roots. The Airborne Toxic event, their first album, first of all, you hear amp buzz and stuff in there all the time. I love it. It's great. Because it's an indie record with a more old school sound while still having that modern edge. Like it doesn't sound old when you're listening to it, but you can be like, this could have been inspired by something from the 70s, and that's where the roots are. But it sounds current, and this is now. And aside from the amp buzz, there was one part where, I can't remember the name of the song. If I find it, I'll put it in the show notes, but I'll put the album in there no matter what. On one song, you can hear voices in the background. And I remember tweeting to one of the band members saying, hey, did you guys record this on tape? And then you were using tape from a previous session? Because it was from 2006 or 2007. So it's like, okay, that borderline of it might have been tape, it might have been digital, I don't know. And they replied saying, no, that was actually the microphones were picking up AM radio signals from Asia. It was either Korea or Japan. And so there's this phenomenon where at night, AM signals travel much further, and they can travel literally halfway around the globe. So they were picking up those radio signals, and instead of saying, well, we're just going to record during the daytime, they said, no, this is cool. We're going to leave it in. Like, I don't know if they expected people to notice it, but either way, if you listen closely to that song, I really hope I can put it in the show notes, you will hear voices faintly in the background. And it's, I don't want to say it's haunting, but it's amazing the first time you hear it, because it's just like, wow, like, this recording's real.
Yep. Production and quality.
It's character, yeah. You got to leave the mistakes in, but you got to know what mistakes to leave in. So, and that's genre dependent, and it's style dependent, and it's project dependent. And I mean, like Frank Ocean is another great example of like lo-fi, hi-fi, like very mainstream, very well-known artist. You listen to like Blonde, he's got recordings on that record that are obviously taken on an iPhone, like when they're in a car somewhere, but it's not every track on the record. And it was, again, it was still professionally mixing all of that stuff in. And that's, yeah, again, it's lo-fi, hi-fi. It's not lo-fi, lo-fi.
Yeah. Anybody that wants to hear a good compare and contrast, go listen to a Maroon 5 current song, and then go listen to an Under Oath song. Now, listen, and you listen for things like guitar scratches and breath. Like, that's such a popular noise in the unplugged underground music scene. You know, things like fingers sliding across a fretboard, little tiny subtle nuances like that, where it's like you get into this really, like you were saying, this hi-fi, super polished, nice and crisp, clean. A pop record, they're going to edit like 99% of those things out. But you get more into like grittier music where it's like, oh no, like maybe a little bit of that guitar feedback, maybe that's good. The more of those things that you can incorporate, and really it's not the more of them, it's the more correct ones. You know, you don't want a breath before every single line. But if you've got some really powerful lines that you're really trying to convey, like this emotional, like grievous emotion, or just really put yourself out there, like maybe like having a nice breath before that line is going to be really good. So in my mind, I kind of view those things as like a rapper saying, yeah, or, oh, you know, because it's like, it's this perfect little like, oh, here's a one syllable word that I can throw in. So that way I don't have to like, I can still say exactly what I want to say. And then I can add a random number of syllables in order to make it fit exactly how I need it. So those are just like little tips, tricks, tools of the industry that people, you know, they love to use. And they're, when used correctly, they can be very, very powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about finding that context and knowing when a sound is appropriate and when it isn't. And I think that's one of the main things that a producer can do. So Greg, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Oh, our pleasure. First of all, I want to shout out, obviously, if people want to get mastering from you, they can go find you. Where should they find you? And are there certain genres that you prefer to work with?
So, I mean, I'll definitely have a conversation with anybody. Whether or not it's a good fit, we'll just get to in that conversation. My website has my portfolio. It's www.greglloyd.com. That's GREG horizontal dash LLOYD.com. I'm sure it'll be in the show notes. And I've got a portfolio like right up front on that. And it's a before and after, which is another thing I'd recommend for anybody who wants to learn more about mastering or who doesn't like understand what mastering adds to the table. The best way is just to listen to a before and after. And a lot of mastering engineers, myself included, will have that as part of their portfolio. So like on mine, for example, it's just a set of audio files you can play through in different styles. And I shift between the mix that got delivered and the finished master throughout. So you can, in real time, kind of hear what the differences are. And a lot of mastering engineers will have those. And I would suggest definitely, just like anybody you're going to hire, listen to their portfolio, make sure that their style matches what you want to do. And also, one thing with mastering in particular, you want to hire somebody who can be transparent to the vision of the mix that you've already set. So, yes, I'm going to be doing stuff, and yes, I'm going to be adding things and making it sound X, Y, and Z, but you're not trying to remix the tune when you're mastering. And especially some of perhaps like the lower tier mastering engineers or people that maybe are just getting some experience, they tend to be a little bit more heavy-handed. So the main value from getting somebody that can work with a lot of different styles and that has a little bit more experience is that they tend to be a little bit more transparent to the mix. So it's just going to sound like how it should sound, but better, rather than super different necessarily. Though the changes are very noticeable. It's one of these things that's kind of hard to talk about, but as soon as you hear it, you're going to be like, okay, yeah, I get it. Yeah, so greglloyd.com. You can check my portfolio out. Feel free to contact me there and we can work something out if you want. I do free test masters, which is definitely something I love to do and I'm happy to do. So if you have any questions or if you want to see what it would sound like if your music was mastered, just shoot me a single and I'll shoot you out a test and you can hear for yourself and kind of see what's going on.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing that information. I definitely encourage artists to go check that out, listen to the songs. And then you also do the DIY music guide. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and where people should find that?
Yeah, so DIY Music Guide is it's an Instagram channel and a website and actually a book. A lot of this stuff was inspired by like my experiences as a mastering engineer, seeing such a wide variety of different mixes and recording qualities coming into the studio. I work with a wide range of artists from like very small indies to like bigger people that are maybe doing more highly produced stuff later on in their careers. And so the variation in that was really striking. And so I wrote a book to kind of try and even some of that out and to get some of the good technical knowledge into the hands of the DIY people that were making, such great creative records to try and kind of bring the creative and the technical side together. So the website is kind of a blog format where I have different posts that are usually a mix of like technical deliverables and like some music business stuff. There's also an Instagram channel, which is not exactly the same, but kind of more of a short form of that. And then the long form is the actual book. It's a 150-page guide to home recording. It's called DIY Music, a Practical Field Guide. And it basically goes through the entire creative process that you would need to know if you were coming at this as somebody without any kind of formal recording education or experience. It'll tell you all the gear that you need. It'll tell you what to think about. It'll be an overview of how the mixing process works, how the entire creative process works. So it was meant to kind of be a field guide format that would take you through the entire process of both writing and recording and releasing a tune. So yeah, check all those out and hopefully it's good, valuable information.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. So those will all be in the show notes. Just shot you a follow on Instagram as well. Didn't know about that until now. So I'm glad you mentioned it. But yeah, all those links will be in the show notes. And then last but not least, I think you also had something for our listeners. Is that correct?
Yes. So for BandHive listeners, I've got a free studio planner that you can download. If you just go to my website, greglloyd.com/BandHive, there's just a fun free little worksheet, which has an area where you can kind of sketch your space out, a list of gear you might need, some kind of goals and thoughts of what you're going to use the space for. It's a great kind of initial planning tool. If you're trying to start a home studio and you don't know where to start, it's a great way to kind of visualize your space, think about what you're trying to achieve with the home studio, and then kind of list some of the technical things that you would need to make those things happen.
Oh, that sounds so useful. Well, Greg, thank you again for joining us. Is there anything else you want to put out there? Anything else you want to add or share?
Just keep making music in your bedroom. Like, it's awesome and it's going to be great. And, I think lo-fi, hi-fi, and bedroom records are here to stay because they really do work. It's just a question of finding the correct balance between lo-fi and hi-fi that's relevant to your work and where you want to take your career.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you again for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you, and I hope you have an awesome rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
That does it for this episode of the BandHive podcast. Thanks so much to Greg Lloyd for coming on the show and talking about not just DIY mastering and the philosophy behind home recording, but also his advice for DIY artists. Such a pleasure to have great guests like Greg on the show. And if you know anyone who's in the music world, either a musician or somebody who works with musicians who would have something to share on the business side of running a business, a band or a solo project or whatever it may be, please let us know. Just send an email to james@bandhive.rocks with who you think we should talk to, and we will look into it. Aside from that, if you're listening in Apple Podcasts or iTunes, please go leave us a review and rating. It helps us so much to get the show in front of more people and help more artists. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back with another episode next Tuesday at 6 a.m. in your favorite podcasting app. Until then, have a great week, stay safe, and of course, as always, keep rocking.